we managed to survive and ultimately cemented our status in this rough world. The challenges to maintain a thriving settlement are closely related to the growing demands of our people, who are now striving for prosperity. Can you live up to their expectations?
Hi, my name is Matthias and I'm one of the developers at Gentimat. Today I'm going to show you Endzone, a world apart.
Humanity survived. Our ancestors have destroyed the world, and we had to pay the price. With over 100 years without sunlight, but we have prepared ourselves for our chance to make things right. They stole from us a life of happiness. Still, we will make the best of it. Even though Mother Earth is grim and tainted, we have managed to survive. And we will keep surviving.
We finally left the Endzone. Just look at this beautiful scenery. It's marvelous, even though it's a bit different from what we had pictured. We were able to secure a few basic resources and are storing them in our bus. I'm glad we prepared ourselves well for this kind of scenario, especially since our inventories in the Endzone ran low. Don't forget that if you need additional information, you can look at our survival guide at any time. Well done. Everything you need to know should be right here. I think the time has come for us to at last build ourselves a new home here. Before we can construct buildings at all, we have to assign the profession builder to several settlers so that they can take care of construction contracts. In general, it's your responsibility to decide which tasks are important. All right. Your builders will be ready as soon as construction contracts have been issued. The first thing we ought to do is to establish a working water supply. So we'll move on to our first construction contract. Place and build a jetty by a lake in the vicinity of your town center. Very good. The jetty was completed as planned. Now we have a place where we can collect water. There are other possibilities to gather water too, but the jetty is the simple. We can obtain and store water from different sources, like a jetty, rain collector, or well in the cistern. The cistern should always be in close proximity to a water source, so that our water carriers don't have to walk too far. We have now installed a working water supply, and water is now transported from the jetty to our cistern. Consider hiring more water carriers if you don't have enough settlers available. You can never have enough water in storage. Now we should focus on food production. It's important to ensure the supply right from the start. A gatherer's cabin, a hunting lodge, or a fishing hut can directly remedy the situation. I suggest starting with a fishing hut, since we're already located near a lake. Good work. We've now taken care of our basic supply via food and water. Make sure you have enough food and water on hand at all times, especially if you want to upgrade your settlement. A population that grows too fast can quickly Crops are another excellent way of getting food, because they constantly grow as long as the soil is moist enough. Each seed has different yields and growing times. This means that it could take some time until your field is ready to be harvested, in contrast to your fishing hut, where production can be right away. Looks good. Remember that we need the widest variety of food sources to stay healthy. You should also plan ahead for drought periods that might come when it's not going to rain. Stock up on food and adapt your production to avoid bottlenecks. I'll show you. At the beginning, we don't have much scrap wood or other resources. We could build a production building, but to obtain resources as fast as possible, it's best that we start gathering right away. Assign a Gather All Resources task. All the settlers who haven't been assigned any... Might come when it's not.
But we have prepared.
Since we now own plenty of resources, we can start to build a real production building. Then you don't have to always make efforts by hand that collecting is taking place. Production buildings are not only easier to manage, they are also distinctly more effective than simple tasks. Don't place production buildings too far away from your settlement. Right on. The best thing for us to do now is to build a forester's lodge to automate our supply of wood and make it more effective at the same time. Good job. You might want to change this building's working area later on to tell your workers where they should get their wood from. And for your information, if you want, you can also tell your Forester's Lodge that they only ought to attend to reforesting an area in order to create a lush, green forest which generations to come. Very good. Now we ought to take care of collecting scrap. Scrap is one of the most valuable resources because the quantities present are limited, and we can recover other resources from scrap. Unlike the task we just had, the scrap yard allows larger quantities of existing scrap to be dismantled than with ruins or wrecks. Great. You can change the working area for the scrapyard, too. We can recycle scrap into 4 additional resources: cloth, metal, plastic, and electronics. We'll do that shortly, but for now we ought to take care of your settlers' needs first. Our people want a place to sleep and live. Cabins fulfill their need for safety and privacy and increase the confidence of their inhabitants. In other words, building cabins increases their willingness to start families and Besides cabins, you can also provide sturdy houses and shelters as housing. Sturdy houses withstand sandstorms better and have an increased storage capacity to boot. Children living in houses gradually fill up the house's stockpiles. Settlers do not reproduce in a shelter because they lack privacy. Let's return from our excursion into housing and refocus on scrap. With the help of a recycler or refinery, scrap can be sorted into 4 different resources. A recycler always takes scrap apart, one resource at a time, while a refinery automatically produces all 4 resources. To start off, you should build a recycler and produce cloth. You can instruct your recycler to produce a different resource at a time. It's important that you focus on the resources you really need, at least in the beginning. Cloth and metal look like good options. Happy settlers are industrious settlers. That's why we ought to look after our people and protect them against the surroundings and dangers, like radiation. So let's start by transforming our newly recovered cloth into protective clothing. A tailor We categorize environmental radiation into 4 levels: no radiation, low level, medium level, and high level radiation. The radiation changes constantly and is influenced by weather and contaminated rain. Protective clothing helps to protect us against this kind of radiation, but it takes a while before it's produced. The tools we brought along from the Endzone are slowly but surely running out. So now, let's focus on manufacturing new tools. The tools will help us to work effectively. We'll need metal for that, so we'll prepare for production by building another recycler. our lovely new tools, we are now prepared to work effectively. Should you ever run out of metal, keep in mind that you can also instruct your workshop to manufacture tools from scrap instead of metal. Though they won't. Down in the end zone, we had sufficient time and resources to educate ourselves properly. But our children don't have this luxury. We ought to build a school and pass on what we've learned. As a result, they will be able to survive and work better and more effectively. Perfect. Besides the fact that educated children work more effectively, we'll also teach them to be more careful with their protective clothing and tools. This, in turn, leads to them staying intact. Now that our population is starting to grow, we ought to again turn our attention to the topic of food production. We are already accumulating fish and tilling our fields. A gatherer's cabin will now enable us to gather mushrooms and berries. Very good. As you can see, the gatherer's cabin is an effective possibility to get food quickly. But watch out. After a drought, it's going to take some time before the plant. Although we are sufficiently supplied at the moment, our survival depends on diligent planning. If we can lay out a plan for an orchard, then we can The orchard has been laid out, and the trees are already beginning to grow. Similar to crops for farming, trees need some time until they are fully grown. But once they have grown, our gatherer's cabin gathers food from the surrounding forests. However, there are any number of other plants there which we can use as well. These plants can be gathered by an herbal hut. The herbs gathered there can be consumed by settlers. on. We can equally utilize the gathered herbs to convert them into medicine later on. It might happen that an illness breaks out in our settlement from time to time and spreads among our settlers. That's why we always ought to have enough herbs on hand. Radiation is the main reason why the health status of our settlement can decrease. Although our settlers already use protective clothing to shield themselves against environmental radiation, it might occur that our sources of water become contaminated. We should start to filter our water to prevent this from happening. We will need a great deal. Great. We can use the charcoal in conjunction with a filtration system to purify our water. Unfortunately, our cistern is not able to do this. Only the water tower has the necessary. It would be a disgrace if we had to demolish our trusted cistern just to erect a water tower in its place. What we ought to do instead is upgrade the cistern itself. A water tower can store much more water and provide. Our new water tower is up and ready for action. Good work. Filtering the water is an important next step because clean drinking water is a key mainstay of any stable society. Let's begin with filtering our water. To save on charcoal, we ought to ensure that at least a little bit of water not contaminated by radiation is being stored in our water tower. Water gained from a well is never contaminated by radiation, so it suggests itself for that purpose. Then we can use the remaining charcoal to produce better protective clothing. Good work. We are continuously taking steps towards being better and better equipped to be able to survive in this hostile environment. Filtered water is a precious asset, and later on we can even use it to irrigate our fields. But let's not get ahead of it. Not only our water can become a hazard for our settlers due to radiation, our food can too. We ought to erect a decontamination post. Very good. The decontamination post is going to supply all buildings that stockpile food and are located in its working area in order to purify the food that has been affected by radiation. It's true. We should never forget that even when we optimally prepare and protect ourselves, we're still going to lose friends and members of our family time and again. We're going to mourn them, come what may. But if we're able to bury them in a cemetery, then we'll get over the pain and let them rest in peace. Okay, the cemetery will help us to quickly get a hold on ourselves and focus on the tasks that lie ahead. It's not a pleasant thought, but that's the way things are. At the very least, we're pioneers, aren't we? Maybe we ought to distract ourselves to lighten up the mood. We can erect a number of buildings to increase confidence in our settlement, including, for example, a campfire or a pump. In this situation, however, our best option would probably be to upgrade our town center. Settlers can visit the new town center, and by doing so, very good. The new town center not only gives us more storage space, at the same time, it functions just like a campfire, too. Settlers can visit the new town center, and by doing so, increase their confidence for a while. Now that we have made efforts to ensure the spiritual well-being of our settlers, we ought to attend to their physical health as well. Our settlers can get sick from time to time. Settlers who have become infected with a disease can die from it if they're not treated. Settlers will go to a medical facility to have themselves treated and will be admitted there, provided With this step, we have ensured the survival of the settlement for a while. Very good work. Since more and more children are being born these days, we should... While cabins are a good way to get settlers to start a family, they only provide limited space. This can quickly lead to people having to live on the street. Allow me to suggest to you that cabins be provided only in a very targeted manner in order to control the population growth of your settlement. Nothing is worse than not having enough resources to provide for everyone. Very good. Remember that when children grow up, they're going to leave their parents' house and look around for a new place to live. It might happen that they don't find... I've already pointed out to you that it could become very dangerous if we were to run out of food at some point. Since a lot of people are going to be living in the new shelter, we ought to provide them with access to food in their vicinity. A hunting lodge can look for one. The hunting lodge equally provides us directly with food, but it functions somewhat irregularly because it relies on wildlife in the surrounding area. Nevertheless, it can be indispensable during a drought because even the deer and wild boar still roam around. However, wild animals can not only be shot, they can be captured too. When a wild animal has been captured, it can be brought to a pasture and served there as livestock. Animals captured by a hunter are brought to a pasture where they are tended to and cared for by herders. Some animals produce resources such as milk or eggs. Other animals can only be slaughtered to eat. You ought to find out for yourself which type of animal brings you which benefit. On each pasture, you can choose which type of animal ought to be kept there. You must provide water for the animals you keep on your pasture. This enables them to survive and reproduce. When enough animals are fully grown, the herder will start to slaughter them. If you don't want animals to be slaughtered, you can also instruct the herder not to do so. Now your herders know how they ought to handle the animals. And now that you've already captured several animals, don't forget to instruct your hunters to hunt animals again in the future so that they can continue. With our increased production, our stockpile is going to run out soon. The supply routes for our production buildings are getting longer and longer too. To tackle these problems, you ought to build a temporary storeroom and have roads laid out. Good. Temporary storerooms increase your settlement's general storage capacity. Place them in a targeted manner in order to shorten the routes for goods between your production buildings. Roads are equally a great benefit because settlers moving on roads can go distinctly faster than on a normal. To improve the whole thing even further, we can build a market to improve logistics at the settlement. Besides being an enormous stockpile for resources that is even able to store water, the market is responsible for distributing resources within your settlement. What's more, it also increases your settlers' confidence. Logisticians are able to amass resources from the whole settlement and bring them to the market. This improves the flow of your products and leads to your settlers having to walk shorter distances to fulfill their individual needs. The combination of these attributes makes the market the ideal building when you want to enlarge or even relocate your settlement. The larger your settlement gets, the farther some settlers have to travel to get to all of the food you produce. To make life a little easier for them, you can build a food station. Logisticians who work at the food station will collect food from your storage buildings and production facilities and bring it to the food station. With the new food station, your settlers are now able to supply themselves with food directly on site. If your settlement is supposed to grow even further, you can think about whether you want to provide additional food stations. Distributing food at your settlement is going to prove to be extremely practical. However, your settlers not only need food to survive, they need water too. To be able to distribute water in a targeted manner, you can build a water point. Now that your settlers also have a water point available, they can supply themselves with water and food. Similar to how it's done at the food stations, this enables you to precisely... Since we have our logistics under control, now we can concern ourselves with the weather and its challenges. We can build a weather station to enable us to make a forecast regarding upcoming weather and learn if potentially contaminated rain might be coming our way. It can also be used to prepare our crops and rainwater collectors we might have against contaminated rain by covering them. Very good. Now that we know what sort of weather awaits us and how we can protect ourselves against contaminated rain by covering our crops and rainwater collectors, we ought to attend to collecting the rain. Rain not only humidifies the soil, it can also be automatically collected via rainwater collectors to generate a steady flow of additional water. Since we've already built our weather station, we're able to decide what kind of circumstances would make us want to cover our rain collectors. Never forget that our settlers might get sick if we distribute water contaminated with radiation at our settlement, even if they're wearing protective clothing. We can have our crops covered to shield our seedlings against radiation. But once they've been covered, actually they won't be irrigated with rain anymore. To rectify this problem, we can build an irrigation plant. As long as our irrigation plant is supplied with filtered water, it is able to neutralize a possible contamination of the soil due to radiation. But watch out. When water contaminated with radiation is fed into the system, this can lead to precisely the opposite. Alongside contaminated rain, there are other environmental hazards, such as sandstorms or droughts. The soil dries out during a drought, and sandstorms sweep across the landscape from time to time. These sandstorms can damage your buildings, and you can decide which type of task your builders ought to give priority to at our town center. You can instruct them to merely repair buildings, to erect new buildings, or to do both at the same time. This enables you to react quickly in crisis situations. For instance, in the event of a sandstorm, you can quickly attend to having damaged buildings repaired. Now that we've taken care of all the necessary needs of our settlement, such as food, water, protective clothing, and tools, our next efforts ought to focus on increasing the settlement's overall productivity. A research station allows us to develop different technologies. Very good. With this new research station and the ability to acquire electronics from scrap, we can provide our settlement with all the materials we need. The research station is very useful in enabling us. Down in the Endzone, we dealt with the concept of a solar collector. This The solar collector produces energy by capturing sunlight and feeding this energy into a grid. The solar collector also gives us all the relevant information we need to keep an eye on our settlement's power consumption. Each of your buildings automatically hook up to this power grid when you set up an electric power pole within the building's range. Buildings supplied with electricity work distinctly more effectively and produce faster as a result. What's more,